All right, we're in it. Thank you for joining us for episode 2 of the podcast. We're still trying to figure out a name, but I want to give a quick shout out to Jay Browns from Glenwood. He's the only student that commented.
Attaboy, Jay. We appreciate you.
On the last one. So if you guys have any questions or ideas that we could talk about, topics that you want us to touch on, go ahead and comment them down below, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. So, everybody, we got with us this week Chris Randall. I could give all of the names, all of the details about Chris, but Chris, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience.
Yeah, definitely. So, as Zayne said, my name is Chris Randall, and I am the youth resident at Calvary Walnut Creek, as we like to call it, though, the Crick. So feel free to continue that on, because I think it's starting to stick.
I think it's sticking.
Yeah. It's sticking.
Yes,
it was once a little baby, but now it's probably a toddler.
You gotta say it, the Crick.
The Crick.
You guys also have the best gang sign of any campus, though.
Yeah, it's like you make a little W and then the C. It's pretty great.
That's a good one.
It's super simple, easy.
It's simple, but does it need to be complicated? That's really.
I guess that's true.
We don't got nothing in Glenwood.
I know it's like
G-Wood. That's almost.
I don't know. Something or another. We'll figure it out. But
yeah. So as a youth resident, I oversee the middle school and high school ministries for the Walnut Creek campus. I've been a resident for almost going on 2 years. It'll be 2 years in June, which was actually just a month after you started, is when I started.
Yep.
So yeah.
So technically, I would be considered the resident. And Chris would be considered vice resident.
Recently promoted vice resident, so
it's a big deal.
We love
I'm
having
excited.
you on. Love having you in the cabinet. Love having you on staff. It's been great. But if you guys were with us last week for the podcast, my name is Zayne Knatzer. I'm the student pastor in Glenwood, and this is James. He's at our Shadow Lake campus as a student pastor as well. And so we've started this podcast to equip coaches, parents, and students with knowledge of the Bible where they can take it into their lives and learn and grow and impact people around them as well. So we've started a series at Collective, our youth group, on Wednesday nights called The Ark, where we're diving deep into the Bible, into the overall story arc of the Bible. And so last week, James and I had a conversation about creation, God's creation. What was his plan for creation? And this week, Chris delivered a message on the fall. And so if you were watching last week's message or last night's message, we record this every day on Thursdays, and we're going to try and get it out as soon as possible. So last night, Chris delivered a message on the fall.
Yep.
Chris, do you want to give us like a quick recap, summarization of what your message was?
I'll keep it super brief. Also, if we produce a pretty good episode, so if you missed it, it's always up on YouTube. So go ahead and check it out.
The episode was great.
It was great. A little dodgeball. It was pretty awesome. You did a great job as a ref.
All of it was good.
It was just awesome. But yeah, as the fall, of course, following the other week of creation, I really just kind of wanted to touch base on the fact that it wasn't necessarily God's plan for the fall of humanity. And I think there's a misconception that God was in control of it all, and like He is the one who made this earth so bad. And many people might ask the question like, oh, why has God just like made this life horrible, or why does all these bad things happen? Like, why did God do this, God do that? When really, when you look at the story of the Bible, you see people making the conscious decisions to move farther and farther away from God. And so I really just wanted to touch base on that in my sermon, and that's kind of what I focused on, because too, like, we have commands or laws, of course, that God has laid out for us. But I think a misconception with that too is that people think like, oh, God just wants to limit our ability to do things, or He doesn't want us to have fun. Mm-hmm. When really, like, He's looking out for our best interest, and like those things are in place because God, when He created life, He knows how it's supposed to go.
Yeah, definitely.
And He wants us to experience the best life possible, and so that's why He has that outline. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, like you see in the Bible, people willingly to choose to go against those things or disobey those laws, and you see sin creating more sin. And in the Bible, you just see this downward spiral of humanity as they just move farther and farther away from God, but also farther and farther away from God's original design for life.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, and so the immediate impact of that sin that we see in Genesis is Cain and Abel. And I know you touched on that in your story. And then descending down that line, we come into the people, God's chosen people, the Israelites. And so, James, do you want to talk a little bit about how the fall plays into the story of God's chosen people, the Israelites, and how they play into that story too.
And so this is all before like the law, right? In Moses, and so that's like a little later in the story. But before there's laws and expectations that God sets on a certain people group, He chooses them. Like He goes out of His way to choose these people as I'm going to redeem the world, which we'll talk about next week. I'm going to redeem the world through these people. And they have no idea really what they're getting themselves into, because they're living in a culture that has like worshiping tons of gods for different things.
Yeah.
And it's socially acceptable that you can worship tons of different gods. You can worship God for your crops, God for family, God for like every different aspect of your life. You worship a different God for that thing. And then you have this Yahweh character step into the story and says, hey, I'm choosing you uniquely to be my people, and so I'm just choosing you, and so you in return, all you have to do is just choose me. And for a culture like that, like would probably blow your mind when even up and before this, like though that culture, those Israelites, not necessarily termed Israelites yet, right, but that people group, they still like they were okay with having like different gods, and they in general have like kind of descended through this, and you kind of, they kind of know that they're supposed to be this people group, but when you don't have, when God wasn't walking with them in that, like I know they probably knew that we were supposed to have this one God, but He felt distant from them, and God was about to get really close to them. And so as this storyline progresses and you follow their story, you see them like they are kind of a case study for just people, right? So we see all these different nations that come against them and around them, and we see blips of other people, but a lot of the Old Testament is centered around this one people group. And I think that is so fascinating, because I think we like to think that we're really far removed from a lot of the things that people struggled with in the past or the time of Jesus. But these are the same exact things that we struggle with, is what, like God was physically with them, and they could see Him in a pillar, like in the cloud, and God rested on the mountain. He was in the tabernacle, right, as they followed the whole thing. He led them out of oppression, helped them part the sea so they could walk over it, like all these different things, and they still doubted.
Yeah.
You know? And so for us as people to even say, like, God, I need to see a sign. Yeah. You know, it's like these people group had many signs, and they never got it. Yeah. Like, and so I guess to answer your question, where does this fall like come in? It just shows our need for our Savior, and it shows our brokenness. Yeah. But it also shows God's patience with how long He was willing to uphold both sides of the covenant. So He comes into this covenant with His people of, you choose me, I'm going to choose you. Yeah. And that's like maybe a pretty like broad way to establish what that covenant meant. But they don't uphold that. They like turn multiple times, go to different things, don't do what God asked them to do. And God has the right then they broke that covenant. He has the right to leave them, but He doesn't. Yeah. And so even through the fall, you can see, like, I think you just learn so much more about God's character. Oh, and so the thing that I get through the Israelite story so much is that even though the Israelites are this way, and we as people are this way, God is still going to be there with us and uphold both sides of the covenant for us. Yeah. And I think that's super powerful.
Yeah, and His holiness just covers all of it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's just, even in the midst of the brokenness that we see immediately following Adam and Eve's sin in the garden, and Cain and Abel's story of death and rejection from the garden, we see God's holiness covering everything. Almost immediately, like who knows how long it was between literally taking a bite of the fruit and God's speaking to Adam and Eve, but he curses the serpent. You're going to crawl on your belly for the rest of the days of your life. And then He talks to Eve, and He says, he's talking to the serpent, and He says, her offspring is going to crush your head, and you're going to strike his heel. But guess what?
Like, and that is the first sign of being like, I'm going to fix this.
I'm going to fix it. Yeah. Immediately after, we just ruined everything. Yeah. Immediately after, it's just ruined.
Like, you guys broke this, but I am going to fix it.
Yeah, right away.
And the cool thing is even the phrase, like, her child, like, God's still allowing us to be a part of the story, knowing that we're broken. Yeah. And that's a huge portion of the fall, is God's still using people to push the mission forward. And even now, as we're in like the modern time and Jesus has come and the church has been established, He's still using broken people to advance his mission when he doesn't need us.
God has the ability to bring good out of everything, and he is working in through all things to return or to make it good. And so, like, when it comes to like bad situations, like, I don't know if I necessarily believe that everything that happens that's bad, that God is pulling that string. But what I do believe is God is able to use that situation and somehow work it and turn it into something good. And so that's kind of where I sit with that. What do you guys think?
That's super solid. And I think going back to what I said about God's holiness, how holy would God be if he didn't punish bad things, you know?
Yeah.
And we see the entrance of every bad thing that we see through the fall of man, through the sin. Death found a portal into creation, and that's, I mean, maybe this is an extreme view, but that's why we see tsunamis that kill 500,000 people. We see volcano eruptions. We see sicknesses, especially in this time. And we see this thing. And that's, I believe, God's holiness saying, this is not my plan for it, but I can't continue. I can't let these things go unpunished.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be holy if I did. You know, God is just transcendent above all of what we experience. And so in that, in his omnipotence, in his perfect power, his ultimate power, how foolish would it be, I think, on my end to say, how could God let these things happen? You know, like how could this bad thing happen if God is good? And that's one of the biggest questions in all of humanity. But if we as Christians believe that God is who he says he is and ultimately powerful, then how could we doubt his plan for us? Like Chris said, like God can take any bad thing that we think is bad and turn it for something good at any point in the future, when in the moment we might think, oh, this is a terrible thing that I can't deal with. It's like, I love this image of, as a parent, I'm not a parent, but as a parent, they take their kids to the dentist. And kids don't like the dentist, and it causes them pain, and they don't like it. But guess what? Because of that, they live longer because their teeth don't fall out and rot and they die, right? So it stinks in the moment. It's terrible and you're scared. But guess what? It produces benefit that you don't see in the moment. So,
well, that even when it comes into the fall and God establishes the law, right? So I did a study a long time ago on some of the Levitical food laws of why would God make people do these things? And so one of them is sprouted grains. I think it's one of the more interesting things. But you were supposed to like wet the grains, let them sprout overnight before using them. And what we know now is that when you do that, it actually allows bacteria to, like when it sprouts, bacteria can grow that it's actually going to help with your digestive system.
Yeah.
And how important would that be if you lived in the desert? You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, so it's like all these food laws, it's like, when we're back to that covenant idea, right? Like you put your trust in God, and he's going to, like, you choose him, and he's going to choose you as this people group. So when it's this one specific storyline, you see that, and it's like, hey, if you put your trust in God, like he knows your best interest, and that's why you're doing these things. And some of you respecting God and having the fear of God, that's like the beginning of wisdom. That's what the book of Proverbs says, is like the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And so out of respect and fear of God, if you do that, like it ends up being just benefiting yourself. Yeah. You know, and that's kind of how a lot of those things kind of get wrapped into.
It goes back to, God is not like the puppet master that has us on a string, and he's like, look at that, I get to make him do this and do this and do this. Yeah. And bad, right? We play a huge role in everything that happens. Yeah. Right? Yeah. And so we have to look at ourselves and look at, like, what has God given us to work with, and take a 30,000-foot view of that and think, as the God of creation, how could this impact his people for good? And we need to take that perspective and realize, like, in the moment, yes, it's horrible, and we can't imagine in the moment what good could come out of it. But we have this promise of redemption. Yeah. We have this promise of eternal life, and immediately after we ruin it, God says, I'm going to fix it. Yeah. Right. And so next week we're gonna take a deep dive into redemption. But do you guys have anything else that you want to touch on about the fall?
Yeah. So I was just thinking about this, right? So we see the fall happen, and then God uses Moses to give the people the law. Yeah. Right. Yep. And so then you have the law that these people are supposed to follow, and this is going to be their way to make themselves right with God, and they just constantly are getting that wrong. Right? And I think so much of the Old Testament storyline is to prove to us as people now, like that can look back and see it with 20/20 vision, right? But even the people in the moment, like, hey, this system isn't working, and so that what God, like what all the Old Testament is pointing to, we believe that that's pointing to Jesus Christ and the fulfillment of that covenant through Jesus, which we'll get to that next week, right?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But as they're like wrestling through this, it shows their need for something else to step in and intervene for them,
Yep.
and fulfill the covenant in ways that they can't, right? So in this time when you broke the covenant, you had to make yourself clean, and you had to sacrifice animals, and you had to like do all these things, and people, like, we're not good rule followers.
No.
Like, we are horrible
The
at
worst.
it. And so
worst.
sometimes I wonder, why was that period so long between the garden, the gap to the law, to when they received the law? Why was that gap so long?
Yeah.
Like, why didn't he just do that with
Yeah.
Abraham at the beginning when God instituted that covenant, and he's like, hey, Abram, I'm choosing you. You're going to go to this land, and I'm going to bless all people through you. I wondered, like, why he didn't do it then. And then also the gap between the law and Jesus. Why was that so long?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know?
I like that you mentioned that, because I think too, when you read the Bible, it's so easy to forget the time that could be between verses. Like, you can read it and think that it's just literally happening the next hour, when
Yeah.
really there's so much
Generations,
time, like
generations,
right.
Hundreds of years.
And it's just
Abraham
so easy
to Isaac
to just
to Jacob to Joseph to then the point where no one even remembered what Joseph had did in
Yeah.
rescuing Egypt.
Yeah.
The dude saved Egypt
Yeah.
from destruction, and then the rulers didn't know about him.
yeah.
You know, like, that's so much time.
And again, that goes back to just God's character
Yeah.
and just His patience for people. And yeah, it's just crazy to look back on that.
His sovereign rule over everything. And I mean, I think it comes back to the phrase in the New Testament that in the fullness of time, God sent forth His Son to redeem humanity, right? So that's also part of, in the moment for us, it seems like, all right, we're ready. Jesus, come quickly. Come now. Like, this will be a great time. But
Yeah.
God's plan is so much better and just transcendent above anything that we can imagine in the moment. So, yeah, that's super good.
And, you know, there in the New Testament, Jesus is like walking with those people. And we just talked about this passage because Scott talked about it with Easter. But, you know, Jesus shows up after being resurrected, and he hears people talking. He's like, what happened? And like, have you not heard? Like, all this stuff happened. And and then Jesus starts talking to them, and he opens their eyes to the scriptures and like explains how all of this was pointing to him coming and dying, right? And then they were like, it just clicked with them, right? And I know, like, we understand this now because we've like looked back. We know Jesus has come. We have all this knowledge, but there's still probably lots of things to the Bible that maybe like our eyes probably still aren't open to.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we can I think we can still pray and have like our eyes open to those things through the Holy Spirit now. But I'm excited for the day to come where we fully understand the true goodness of God. And I don't know. I don't think we'll ever be able to fathom all of that. But like, I'm excited for the day to come where we truly understand the storyline, the arc of the Bible as we're talking about it, like, and just like get it all.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
Like, that's gonna be good. That's gonna be okay.
Road to Damascus experience.
Yes. So, question for you guys: why doesn't God? Like, why do we think that God doesn't intervene? Like, so with these things, right? So we've established earlier that it is a result of the brokenness of the world. It is the brokenness of the world why these things happen, right? This was not God's plan for people. So God's not pulling a string making all these things happen, but it's the natural brokenness of the world that these things now have a platform to exist. So why? A question we hear a lot is like, why doesn't God step in to stop these things from happening?
Yeah. That's a deep question.
I mean, I hope it's not a trick question, but I think God does step in to intervene. And I think maybe a more appropriate question is, why does it feel like God doesn't step in to intervene?
Yeah, that's probably a better question.
On
to ask.
on our behalf, why does it seem like God is not with us, and how God could allow these things to happen? But I think as God's people, as people with the Holy Spirit indwelling inside of us, like, through our interaction, through our testimony, through our evangelism, through our reaching people, I think God is intervening, right? And so it's how I think, like, obviously I understand why doesn't God just come and snap and get rid of COVID-19, you know? But Like that's I think that
Do that
could be
little,
enough.
little Thanos style.
Yeah.
Just come and snap and just it's gone.
All right, everybody. Quick. What do they call it? Where they take everybody up to heaven. Has it already
Tribulation.
happened? God's already taken his chosen people
pre-trib or post-trib, like people.
Yeah.
Podcast episode 85.
Yeah, I know, right? It was probably
That's a really good point you make, because how many stories have we heard of where people had no idea what God was doing in the moment, but years down the road they can look back and see how God intervened.
Yeah.
Like there could be a situation, like I think in this COVID-19, this whole situation, like we're going to look back and be able to pull things from this season that we're going to be thankful for and that we've experienced growth in. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's a good question to ask, because it's so easy to, in the moment where you're hurting, where things are hard, to ask the question. But oftentimes we've heard the story so many times that when someone looks back a month later, years later, whatever, they can be grateful for that season because they've seen where God has stretched them.
Yeah. Well, and have we personally asked God to intervene, or do we just expect
God to do something, and then we just have the excuse to be mad at him when we feel like he hasn't done what we want him to do?
Yeah.
And I think, that's a lot of the Israelites' story, is them wanting God to do certain things, right? So we see like quail, we see like them feeling like, we want a king. God, we want to be just like every other nation. They all have kings and we don't have one. And God's like, well, I want to be your king. Like, no, we want a physical king. And God's like, you want a king? Fine, have a king. And he gives them someone that is at first like walking with God, but is really just ends up being like a bad king.
Yeah, a bad dude.
Yeah, and then people wonder like,
God, how can you give us
God, this king sucks. God gave us this?
What are you doing?
Like, well, this wasn't God's plan for people.
Yeah.
And I think so much of it is understanding and looking back to, like, why does God allow this? And we think everything that God allows is his administrative choice.
Yeah.
And is like allowing things to happen, right? We're like, well, if God isn't stopping it, then he must want it to happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's like getting into some rough theology, in my opinion. But when we talk about it, like, ultimately, God has intervened through the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
In this broken world, he has intervened once for all, which we'll get into next. The time that I feel that I am pursuing God the most is when there is difficult things in my life, because that's when I need God to show up to help me get through something or need to provide something for me.
Yeah.
And so, we could get on a whole nother podcast of why does it seem that people's faith in developing countries are stronger than people's in developed countries?
Yeah.
You know, like people who have less and are in more issues tend to have higher faith in God. Mm-hmm. And like, what's up with that?
Yeah.
You know,
right.
But I don't know. I could go on forever. So
that's super, super good. And I think we're about running out of time, but this has been a super good conversation, and I'm thankful for you guys that have tuned in to watch us. I'm definitely positive that we can turn back to this topic at a later date. Yeah. And maybe we have another podcast where it's
about one specific issue. But if you guys have if you have any thoughts about what we've just said or something you would like to comment on this video, we want, like, we'll be able to come. We would love to respond, have a little dialogue with you. And if you comment on it, we'll talk about it. We'll mention it on the next podcast. So say something, and we want this to be like a two-way street, like Zayne said last podcast episode. We want to hear from you. So comment on the video, and we'll address that in the next podcast.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much. We're peacing out. We got to come up with a peace out statement, or like a see you next week.
God already intervened, so get off him.
Yeah, he did it. It's done. See you next week for redemption. We'll peace out. See you guys later.